And welcome to Chapter 19. This is definitely probably the most difficult chapter that we'll do in this class, so make sure that if anything is unclear, you go back over and watch the full lecture, okay? This chapter, it adds on to the previous chapter. The previous chapter, we explained net exports, net capital outflow, and exchange rates. We're going to bring these all together into a theory of the open economy. I call it, it's a triple model because there's three models going on here, including the market for loanable funds, which we've learned about before. And this is going to kind of be the way that we understand the open economy. All right, so we're going to understand trade balance, exchange rate, and capital flows by examining this big triple model. Okay, so let's remind ourselves what the loanable funds market does. Okay, so in the previous chapter, we found that in an open economy, saving is equal to investment plus net capital outflow. Remember that this part was true in the closed economy, and we didn't have NCO in the closed economy, and so this is going to be very similar to the market for loanable funds you've seen before, okay? Where does the loanable funds come from? Savers. Where's the demand curve for loanable funds? Well, it comes from purchase of domestic capital, that's the I, or the purchase of a foreign asset, that would be NCO, all right? So demand for loanable funds is equal to I plus NCO. And don't forget that S depends positively on the real interest rate, so the supply curve will have an upward slope. I depends negatively on R, that means it'll have a negative slope or a downward slope, okay? But what about net capital outflow, NCO? Remember that the demand curve is I plus NCO. Well, let's investigate. So let's imagine we're at this point of net capital outflow. The real interest rate is R, that's the real return on domestic assets here in the United States. Well, imagine if the interest rate fell for domestic assets. More people are going to move their money outside of the United States to try to, maybe buy stocks and bonds from another country. That's going to make NCO go up, right? Because that's basically saying that our capital is outflowing of the United States. When the interest rate here goes down, people move their money elsewhere where they can get a higher rate of return, so NCO goes up. So therefore, NCO also has a negative slope. Okay, so the demand curve total is downward sloping because both I and NCO have a negative slope. And then, just like as before in the market for loanable funds, the interest rate adjusts, so we're at equilibrium in the markets. Okay, let's use that very simple model and analyze the government running a budget deficit when before the budget was balanced. Okay, so I want you to use the appropriate diagrams to determine the effects on the real interest rate and net capital outflow. Why don't you pause this and try to just use the market for loanable funds that I just reviewed with you, and then come back when you're done. All right, so remember that I put the graphs next to each other like this, and I can put two models together to make it like a bigger model, right? So a budget deficit reduces saving. Don't forget, it's when the government runs a budget deficit, it needs to suck up money from somewhere. It sucks it up from the savers. So that's like saying that the savings supply curve is reduced, which makes the interest rate go up, which is going to make, what is NCO going to do? It is going to decrease, right? In other words, more people keep their money in the United States because the interest rate is higher for stocks and bonds in the United States, okay? So when working with this model, keep in mind that the loanable funds market determines R. So first you start here and you find R, okay? And then you move R over to this side, and then that is going to be what determines net capital outflow. All right? Okay, so let's add one more market because we were actually sort of ignoring a market without knowing it. When people send money into the United States from their foreign land to buy stocks and bonds, or when a U.S. citizen buys stocks and bonds from another government, we have to change the currency from dollars into the foreign equivalent. So we're going to do that because we remember that net capital outflow is equal to net exports. So in the market for foreign currency exchange, net exports is the demand for dollars, right? Because foreigners need dollars to buy U.S. net exports, and NCO is the supply of dollars. In other words, U.S. residents, they sell the dollars to obtain the foreign currency they need to buy foreign assets, right? Whenever I move money outside of the United States. The other way to think about it is, right, NCO, this is the money that's net capital outflow that's flowing out from the United States. So this is just the supply of dollars for people that are not in the United States. Okay, don't forget that NX is the demand and NCO is the supply. That's pretty important. And when I go to put this on a supply and demand graph, right, I'm going to go in I'm going to have, just like all supply and demand graphs, right, I'll have a quantity down on this side, and I'll have a price or a value on this side. Well, what are we going to use for the value of dollars in the in the foreign market, excuse me? What is the value of a dollar on the foreign market? It's just the exchange rate, right? E is defined as the real exchange rate. So the number of goods that a U.S. good can buy when I exchange it into dollars, right? So that's the price or the value of a dollar on the foreign exchange market, okay? So we use that on the y-axis as the value of our dollar in the foreign exchange. Okay, now I'm going to put the demand curve, that is net exports, right? And then I'm going to put the supply curve. Now notice it's straight up and down. Go back a couple chapters and realize that the market for money in the domestic market, the supply curve is also straight up and down. We called it the money supply curve. It has to. The reason is because that NCO is determined by the interest rate that I can get either in this country or in another country. It has nothing to do with the exchange rate, right? So no matter what the exchange rate is, the level of NCO that I am sending outside of the country is going to stay the same. So now this part is easy. The real exchange rate just adjusts to balance supply and demand in the market for foreign currency. All right, and so that we determine E. Okay, so just to know how to use this model a little bit better in the market for foreign exchange, let's ask ourselves a question. When a U.S. resident buys imported goods, does the transaction affect supply or demand? Well, you can think of it two ways, and they're both the same, actually. The supply of dollars increases because the person needs to sell the dollars to obtain the foreign currency she needs to buy imported goods. Or you can think of it as the demand for dollars is decreasing because the increase in imports reduces NX, and NX, don't forget, is the demand for dollars, right? So we're going to call the NX the net demand for dollars. Both views are the same. For our purposes, it's a little bit easier to use the second, so we will. Okay, and a very, very similar question. What happens when a foreigner buys a U.S. asset? Okay, so this is talking about not the import-export market anymore, but when a foreigner buys stocks and bonds from the United States. What does it do in the foreign exchange market? Well, you can think about it as increasing the demand for dollars because the foreigner needs dollars to purchase the U.S. asset. Or you can think of it as the supply of dollars falls. Why? Because the foreigner is buying stocks and bonds. He's sending U.S. dollars back into the United States, and NCO, remember, net capital outflow, this is going backwards to NCO. So that makes NCO go down, all right? So we'll think of NCO as the net supply of dollars. So both views are equivalent. We're going to use the second when we manipulate this model further. Okay, let's go ahead and do the exact same problem again, but add in the foreign exchange market. Okay, so we have government budget is balanced and the trade is balanced, and then the government runs a budget deficit. So last time you did this graph, you saw that R rises and NCO falls. But now I want to know what happens to the real exchange rate and the balance of trade. So why don't you finish your model that you started last time, a couple slides ago, and figure this out. Come back to me when you're done. All right, so let's add in the market for foreign currency exchange, right? What happened? Well, we know that the NCO fell because we did that last time, which means the real exchange rate appreciates. That means that one US dollar used to be able to only buy, say, 13 pesos, and now it can buy 20 pesos. And that's what the real exchange rate is appreciating mean. And so it reduces net exports, right? When United States goods get more expensive, then people from foreign countries can't purchase them. And people in the United States, they can purchase more of other goods, so that is going to reduce net exports, right? And since we started out with NX equals 0, meaning a trade balance, the budget deficit causes a trade deficit. This is really crazy. Something you may not have thought was even connected. A budget deficit and a trade deficit is actually causing one to the other. And you look at it, every year that we have a pretty high budget deficit, we end up having pretty negative, you see this is in the negatives, pretty negative trade deficit. And so recently you see we've had a really high budget deficit. That means every year the government spends more than the taxes it takes in, and you look that the trade deficit is really negative. It's like about -5 or so, something like that. Okay, so these things tend to go together. All right, so summary, what did we learn from that last exercise? Well, when the government runs a budget deficit, national saving falls, right? There's fewer dollars to be available for investors to use because the government is sucking them up to finance its budget deficit. The real interest rate rises, domestic investment and net capital outflow fall, the real exchange rate appreciates, and net exports fall, or makes the trade deficit even worse, okay? Now, another effect is that as foreigners acquire more domestic assets, the country's debt to the rest of the world increases. Don't forget, we learned this 2 chapters ago. When we are running a trade deficit, that means that we are importing more than we are exporting, so that some of the imports are paid for by our exports, but the rest of the imports, the extra ones that are more than the exports, the rest of these imports, we're financing them with debt, right? So basically we're selling off stocks and bonds to pay for our imports, okay? And so due to many years of this going on, the United States is the world's largest debtor nation, right? I showed this to you guys last chapter. We owe $4.2 total trillion to the rest of the world. So how do we connect the 2 models together? Well, anything that increases R, you see, will reduce NCO, which is going to reduce the supply curve in the market for foreign exchange, right? So this right here is the first, or is the NCO portion of the first model, and this part down here is the foreign currency one that I taught you separately, but you see that they are actually connected because it's the same NCO. And you want to know what else is really cool? This is actually, right, this is connected over to the market for loanable funds over here, right, because it's the same interest rate that goes here. So really there's a triple model that goes on here, if you can imagine it like this. There's a triple model going on. I call it the super model. Haha. Okay. So when that budget deficit happened, that made the real exchange rate go up, and it makes the real exchange rate appreciate, and of course then the net exports problem get worse. So keep in mind, the loanable funds market determines R, and it's not shown right here, but if you wanted to draw it on, and I recommend you do, I just don't have room on this graph, is you draw it kind of right here, right? That's the market for loanable funds, and then you determine the interest rate from the intersection of the supply and demand in the market for loanable funds. All right, and then that value of R determines NCO, which you get from that top graph there, and then that NCO determines the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market, and you get the real exchange rate, E, capital E. I want to point out that this we're talking in terms of the real exchange rate, capital E. Last chapter we also used little e, which was the nominal exchange rate, but that's not really what we're focusing on right here, right now. Okay, now let's go ahead and play around with this model real quick. Suppose the government provides new tax incentives to encourage investment. So why don't we go ahead and use the triple model, the super model, to determine how this policy would affect the real interest rate, net capital outflow, the real exchange rate, and net exports. Why don't you click pause, take a couple seconds to draw this out, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so let's start in the top part. An investment will increase because the government is providing tax incentives for firms to invest. So demand for loanable funds increases, which is going to increase R. Okay, boom. And that is going to bring the same R over here into the net capital outflow graph. The R will go up. And what will that do to net capital outflow? That will make it decrease. Why? Because the interest rate in America is better. So people are putting their money into America to invest. Money's not leaving. So that means net capital outflow is going down. So then we go down to the market for foreign currency exchange. Remember, this, if I were to draw it would be down here. It would be where the market for foreign currency would be put. But I don't have room, so I'm just going to show it here. And the net capital outflow goes down, which makes the real exchange rate go up, which makes net exports go down, right? Because when the real exchange rate gets too much more expensive, we can't afford as many American goods, or the rest of the world can't afford as many American goods, so we don't export quite as much. Okay, so you'll notice that the tax incentive for investment, that was the second time we did it, this one we did just now, has looked really similar to the budget deficit, right? The real interest rate rises, net capital outflow falls. The real exchange rate rises, net exports falls. But there's a big difference, right? The investment tax incentive increases investment. So if you look in the market for loanable funds, you get a higher Q. That's what this is telling you, right? And so when you have more investment that's being used to, I don't know, open up companies or build factories or buy tractors or something like that, it increases productivity in the long run. Okay? The budget deficit, however, when there was a budget deficit and it reduced the supply curve, we did that one first, it reduces productivity growth and living standards, right? So even though they look very similar, the investment tax incentive increase helps our economy in the long run. The budget deficit hurts our economy in the long run. Okay, let's go ahead and utilize our triple model to think about some sort of trade policy. So a trade policy is any government policy that tries to influence the quantity of goods and services that a country imports or exports, right? They generally come in three forms. A tariff, you put a tax on imports. An import quota, you put a limit on the number of imports. Or voluntary export restrictions. Instead of putting a limit on imports in your country, you just march over to the other country and tell them not to export quite as much. Okay, it's essentially the same as the import quota. And so many times people say, oh my goodness, we need import quotas because we need to save jobs in this industry here. All these cheap imports are flooding into the country and they're hurting our companies here, right? Someone else might say, well, actually, we're also going to try to reduce the trade deficit, right? We can't have net exports be so negative, so if we keep out imports, it's going to help the trade deficit. So let's use our model to see if an import quota helps these goals, all right? So we're going to imagine that an import quota on cars from Japan designed to save jobs in the U.S. auto industry. Well, an import quota does not affect this market at first, right? There's nothing directly that goes, because these are savers and these are demanders and these are, people who are saving. These are firms that are investing, so nothing gets changed at first there. However, what does change is the NCO. All right. Excuse me. So there's nothing that changes up here quite yet. And then when we come down to the market for foreign currency exchange, here's where something changes. We know that a reduction in imports is going to make net exports increase, which is going to make the demand curve shift to the right. Okay, so what does that do to the real exchange rate? It increases the real exchange rate, okay, to restore the equilibrium. So you see that the actual number of exports doesn't change. The net exports demand curve, yes, it shifts out, but because the NCO curve is straight up and down and it doesn't change, it just goes straight up. The real exchange rate becomes more expensive. In other words, we stop importing so many cars, but because the real exchange rate rose, we start importing a whole lot of everything else, okay? And so you see, in general, nothing ends up happening to net exports, right? If the exchange rate could stay low, well, then NX would in fact rise, but since the import quota does not affect NCO, the quantity of dollars supplied is fixed, and that means that the real exchange rate must rise enough to keep NX at its original level. So the policy of restricting imports doesn't reduce the trade deficit at all. Okay, well, does it save jobs, right? That's the next question. So it definitely reduces the imports of Japanese autos, and so that means that U.S. consumers have to buy more U.S. automobiles. That means the U.S. automakers do hire more workers, and it does save jobs in the United States. But don't forget, the real interest rate rises, which means that we can't export to other countries at all because our real exchange rate is too high. Okay, so export industries go out of business, they lay off workers, and it destroys workers in the export sector, right? So it may save jobs in the auto industry, but it does destroy jobs in the U.S. export industries. So there's not really a whole lot of good news for having import quotas. All right, here's another example of how we can use the model. China has accumulated U.S. assets to reduce its exchange rate and boost its exports. Okay, so what happened? Well, the U.S. real exchange rate went up. Higher U.S. imports from China. We import from China a lot. We have a larger U.S. trade deficit. And some politicians want China to stop, right, doing this because, so they say, all right, we're going to restrict trade with China to protect the U.S. industries. But that's really actually just going to hurt United States citizens more because we are enjoying our imports from cheap Chinese imports. Okay, here's another example. In 1994, political instability in Mexico made world financial markets nervous. People worried about the safety of Mexican assets they own, so people sold many of these assets. They pulled their money out of Mexico, and that's called capital flight. It's when you take your assets and remove them from the country on a large scale. All right, let's analyze this effect using the model. Okay, so what's going to happen? Well, as foreign investors pull their money out of Mexico, that's going to make net capital outflow increase first, right? And then the next step that's going to do is it's going to increase the demand, because demand, don't forget, is investment plus NCO. So when NCO increases, then demand also increases, right? So we have a rise on the interest rate, the real interest rate, which then is a slight rise in net capital outflow. Remember, because the money is leaving Mexico. All right, and so as the net capital outflow increases, the supply curve increases in the market for foreign currency exchange, and the real exchange rate value of the peso falls. Okay, so as we can see, this actually happened in Mexico in 1994. This is the value. This is a graph of the value of the peso against the dollar. This has also happened in Southeast Asia in 1997. They had a financial crisis. In Russia in 1998, okay, they had some political instability. In Argentina, 2002, almost defaulted on its loans. This has also happened there as well. Okay, so in conclusion, the U.S. economy is opening up. Remember, in last chapter we saw that exports, imports have been growing for a number of years, and people hold international assets in their portfolios, and firms in the United States borrow foreign capital from foreign countries to finance their investment. Okay. However, we should be careful not to blame our problems in the international economy. Our trade deficit is not caused by other countries' unfair trade practices, but by the budget deficits that we've been running. Right? We showed earlier but with our model, that a budget deficit leads to a trade deficit. So we have stagnant living standards in America or in any place. That has nothing to do with unfair trade or cheap imports coming in. It looks like it has more to do with too little investment because there's too little savings. All right. So when you hear politicians or people comment on these topics, think about the model and try to put it into perspective.